In February of 1959, deep in the frozen Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, 9 experienced hikers died under circumstances so strange that even after decades of investigation, forensic analysis, and renewed government inquiry, no single explanation has ever been fully accepted by everyone who has studied the case. Their tent was found cut open from the inside. Several of the hikers were discovered partially dressed, some without shoes, scattered across the snow as though they had fled in sudden, desperate panic from something inside their own camp. Some had catastrophic internal injuries with no external wounds to explain them. One was missing her tongue. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident. The group at the center of the case was a party of experienced skiers and hikers, most of them students or graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute in the city of Sverdlovsk, organized and led by a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov, for whom the incident and the mountain pass where it occurred would eventually be named. The group consisted of 9 members in total, 7 men and 2 women, most in their early 20s, all experienced in wilderness travel and Grade 2 ski touring, a categorization within the Soviet hiking certification system indicating a meaningful level of prior outdoor experience and technical skill, rather than a group of casual or inexperienced outdoor enthusiasts. Their planned route, undertaken during the final days of January and into early February of 1959, was an ambitious one, a roughly 200-mile ski trek through the northern Ural Mountains, culminating in an ascent of Ortorten, a peak whose name in the local Monsey language is often translated as meaning "don't go there," a detail that, while likely coincidental in terms of its actual etymology, has taken on an almost unavoidable symbolic weight in the decades since the tragedy, frequently cited in retellings of the case despite its uncertain and disputed translation. The expedition was intended, in part, to earn its participants a Grade 3 hiking certification, the highest level within the Soviet system at the time, and the route had been reviewed and approved by hiking authorities before the group departed, a standard practice for expeditions of this scale and difficulty during the period. The group departed from Sverdlovsk in late January, traveling first by train and truck toward the base of their route, before setting out on skis into increasingly remote and difficult terrain. One member of the original party, a man named Yuri Yudin, was forced to turn back early in the expedition due to a recurring illness, a decision that, while disappointing to him at the time, would ultimately save his life and leave him as the sole surviving member of the group, a fact he reportedly carried with considerable difficulty for the remainder of his own life, decades after the tragedy. The remaining 9 hikers continued on into increasingly difficult conditions as they approached the area near Kolitsyakal, a mountain whose name in the Monsey language is generally translated as meaning dead mountain. Another detail that, like the disputed translation of Ortorten, has taken on considerable symbolic resonance in later retellings of the case, regardless of the more mundane linguistic origins likely underlying the name itself. According to the group's recovered diaries and photographs, which investigators later used extensively to reconstruct their final days, the hikers made reasonably good progress through difficult winter conditions in the days leading up to February 1, 1959. On that date, apparently having taken a wrong turn in worsening weather and reduced visibility, the group found themselves on the slope of Kolitsyakal rather than their intended route, and made the decision to make camp directly on the mountain's exposed slope rather than descending back toward the shelter of the tree line below. A decision some later investigators have suggested may have reflected either a desire to avoid losing already difficult ground gain that day, or simply a miscalculation about the deteriorating weather conditions they were facing. The group's tent was set up on the slope, and based on the physical evidence later recovered, the hikers appeared to have settled in for the night in a manner consistent with a normal, uneventful evening, preparing food and, based on some interpretation of a partially eaten meal found at the scene, engaging in ordinary camp activities before what investigators believe was likely a period of rest or sleep. Sometime during the night of February 1st into the early morning hours of February 2nd, something happened inside or near that tent that caused all 9 hikers to leave it in extreme haste. Under conditions investigators would later determine involved temperatures well below freezing, in an area entirely exposed to the elements, roughly a mile from the shelter of the nearest tree line. When the hikers failed to check in as scheduled at the conclusion of their planned expedition, and after a reasonable grace period passed without contact, concerned family members and hiking authorities initiated a search effort. which escalated over the following days into a large-scale operation involving both civilian volunteers and Soviet military and police personnel. On February 26th, more than 3 weeks after the group had last been in contact, search teams located the group's tent on the slope of Kolitsyakhl. What they found immediately struck the search party as deeply unusual. The tent was still partially covered in snow, but had been cut open from the inside, with the majority of the group's remaining equipment, warm clothing, food, and personal belongings still present inside, suggesting the hikers had left in extraordinary haste rather than through any kind of orderly evacuation. Footprints, made by feet either bare, sock-covered, or in some cases only partially shod, led away from the tent down the slope toward the distant tree line. A set of tracks that suggested the hikers had left the relative shelter of their tent and moved directly into sub-zero conditions without pausing to properly dress for the extreme cold outside. Over the following days and weeks, as search teams worked to locate all 9 members of the expedition, the bodies were discovered in stages, scattered across a wide area between the tent and the nearby tree line, under circumstances that, taken together, would come to define the case as one of the most persistently debated unsolved mysteries connected to any wilderness expedition in modern history. The first 2 bodies discovered, found near the tree line beneath a large cedar tree roughly a mile from the tent, were identified as Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko, both found in a state of significant undress, wearing only their underwear despite the extreme cold, with evidence at the base of the cedar tree suggesting they had attempted, with limited apparent success, to climb the tree, based on broken branches found roughly 5 meters up its trunk, and had also attempted to build a small fire nearby, evidenced by burned branches and scorched ground found at the site, though the fire itself appeared to have been small, poorly sustained, and ultimately insufficient to provide meaningful warmth against the extreme conditions. Between the cedar tree and the tent, searchers found 3 more bodies: Igor Dyatlov himself, along with Zinaida Kolmogorova and Rustam Slobodin, each found in positions that investigators interpreted as suggesting they had died while attempting to make their way back toward the tent, perhaps after realizing the severity of the situation the group now faced, though none of them ultimately survived to complete that return journey. Slobodin's autopsy would later reveal a skull fracture significant enough that investigators considered it potentially incapacitating, though not immediately fatal on its own, adding a further layer of physical trauma to a set of deaths already difficult to fully explain through exposure alone. The remaining 4 members of the group were not located until more than 2 months later, in May of 1959, when melting snow finally exposed a ravine roughly 70 meters further into the forest from the cedar tree, where the bodies of Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Alexander Zolotaryov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles were finally recovered, having been buried under several meters of accumulated snow throughout the intervening months of the search effort. The condition of these final 4 bodies, once recovered and examined, introduced the most disturbing and most persistently debated physical evidence in the entire case. Autopsies revealed that Dubinina and Zolotaryov had suffered severe internal injuries, including multiple broken ribs and, in Zolotaryov's case, significant chest trauma, injuries that the examining medical staff compared in their severity to what might be expected from a serious vehicle collision or a substantial fall from considerable height, despite no evidence at the recovery site suggesting either had occurred. Thibault-Brignoles was found to have sustained a severe skull fracture. And in a detail that has remained one of the case's most widely discussed and most difficult to satisfactorily explain, Dubinina was found to be missing her tongue, along with her eyes, lips, and a portion of facial tissue. Injuries that some investigators at the time, and in subsequent decades, have attributed to natural decomposition and scavenging by wildlife during the extended period her body remained partially exposed, while others have argued the specific pattern and location of the missing tissue seemed inconsistent with typical animal activity, without ever definitively resolving the disagreement one way or the other. Notably, despite the severity of these internal injuries, none of the bodies from this final group showed corresponding external wounds, bruising, or other visible trauma consistent with the kind of severe blunt force typically required to produce injuries of this magnitude. A discrepancy that has fueled decades of continued speculation and alternative theorizing about what specifically caused this level of internal damage without leaving more obvious external evidence behind. The official Soviet investigation into the deaths, conducted in the months immediately following the recovery of all 9 bodies, ultimately concluded that the hikers had died as a result of what the final report termed a compelling natural force, an unusually vague and unsatisfying official explanation that has, in the decades since, become almost as famous and as widely discussed as the incident itself, largely because it offered essentially no specific mechanism or clear causal explanation for what that force might actually have been. The investigation was formally closed shortly after this conclusion was issued, and much of the original case file was, for decades afterward, kept classified or otherwise restricted from public access, a decision that, whether or not it reflected any genuinely sensitive underlying information, contributed considerably to the case's later reputation as a mystery potentially involving deliberate government secrecy. In the decades since 1959, an extraordinarily wide range of theories has been proposed to explain what actually happened to the Dyatlov group on the slope of Kholat that night, ranging from theories grounded in conventional natural phenomena to considerably more speculative, and in some cases, outright fringe explanations that have nonetheless persisted within popular discussion of the case. Among the more scientifically grounded explanations proposed over the years is the theory that a slab avalanche, a specific type of snow slide distinct from the more commonly imagined large-scale avalanche, may have struck the tent during the night, causing sufficient injury and panic to explain both the hikers' hasty, underdressed evacuation and, potentially, the severe internal injuries found on several of the bodies recovered from the ravine. This theory gained significant renewed credibility following a detailed scientific study published in 2021, in which researchers used specialized modeling techniques, including methods originally developed by Disney's animation studios for realistically simulating snow behavior, to argue that a small, localized slab avalanche was physically plausible on the specific slope where the tent had been located, and could potentially account for the pattern of injuries observed, even in the absence of the more dramatic avalanche debris that might typically be expected, and that searchers hadn't specifically documented at the original scene in 1959. Other researchers and investigators have proposed alternative or complementary natural explanations, including the possibility that extreme katabatic winds, a specific type of localized, high-velocity wind that can develop under certain terrain and weather conditions, may have created conditions severe enough to force the hikers from their tent, potentially combined with a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, a documented physiological response occasionally observed in advanced stages of hypothermia, in which affected individuals, in a confused and severely compromised mental state, begin removing their own clothing despite the extreme cold, a response that some researchers have suggested could help explain why several of the hikers were found so significantly underdressed for the conditions they died in. Alongside these more scientifically grounded theories, the case has also generated a substantial body of considerably more speculative and, in some instances, explicitly fringe explanations over the decades, including theories involving secret Soviet military weapons testing in the area, alleged encounters with indigenous Mansi people who some early theories inaccurately and without evidence suggested might have been responsible for an attack on the group, and even theories invoking extraterrestrial or supernatural involvement. Explanations that have found considerable traction within certain corners of popular media and online discussion despite lacking any credible supporting evidence, and generally being dismissed by researchers who have studied the case's physical evidence in detail. In 2019, Russian authorities announced a renewed official investigation into the case, driven substantially by continued public interest and persistent requests from surviving family members of the original hikers for a more thorough and more transparent re-examination of the available evidence than the original, famously vague 1959 conclusion had provided. This renewed investigation ultimately concluded in 2020 that an avalanche remained the most scientifically plausible explanation for the deaths, broadly aligning with and lending additional official weight to the avalanche-based theories that had already been gaining increased scientific credibility among independent researchers in the years immediately prior. Despite this renewed official conclusion, and despite the additional scientific modeling supporting the avalanche theory's basic physical plausibility, the explanation has not been universally accepted among all researchers, family members, and independent investigators who have continued studying the case closely, some of whom continue to argue that specific details of the physical evidence, including the particular pattern and severity of certain injuries, the specific missing tissue found on Dubinina's body, and the overall sequence of events reconstructed from footprints and the positions in which bodies were ultimately found, remain difficult to fully and satisfactorily reconcile with an avalanche-based explanation alone. Even one model with the benefit of considerably more sophisticated scientific tools than were available to investigators working the case in 1959. What makes the Dyatlov Pass incident endure as a subject of such sustained international fascination, more than 6 decades after it occurred, is likely some combination of several distinct factors working together. The genuine strangeness of several specific physical details that resist easy or fully satisfying explanation, the decades of official secrecy and vague, unsatisfying government conclusions that characterize the original Soviet-era investigation, and the fundamentally human tragedy at the center of the case, involving 9 young, experienced, and by all accounts well-prepared hikers who, for reasons that remain at least partially unresolved even now, made the sudden, desperate decision to flee their own tent into sub-zero, near-total darkness, several of them without adequate clothing to survive more than a relatively short period in the conditions they now faced. More than 65 years after their deaths, the members of the Dyatlov group are memorialized in the region where they died, with the specific mountain pass itself formally renamed in their honor, and their story continues to be revisited regularly across documentaries, books, and continued scientific and investigative interest from researchers around the world. Whether the 2020 avalanche conclusion represents a genuinely complete and accurate explanation of what happened on Kolit-Syakhl that night, or whether some portion of the case's most persistently strange details will continue to resist full and satisfying explanation regardless of how much additional scientific analysis is eventually applied to the available evidence, remains, even now, a question that continues to divide those who have spent the most time studying this case most closely.